My daughter had her wisdom teeth removed, and the anaesthesia made her admit something terrifying. I have 2 children, Nathan and Anna. A couple of months ago, I took Anna to a private hospital for a procedure to have 4 of her wisdom teeth extracted. Teeth that were well embedded in my daughter's gums, necessitating the use of a general anaesthetic. Necessitating, in fact, a visit to an all-hours private clinic. Time was of the essence. Frustratingly, there were unforeseen delays with other surgeries that day, so Anna endured an agonising wait for what ended up being an extremely late surgery. An extremely involved surgery. The extraction of those impacted molars lasted 2 hours, all in all, and was rather anxiety-inducing for me, too. Now, anybody who's seen the aftermath of such a procedure, in either reality or the YouTube footage of a sadistic parent, knows that it often involves wonky, witty remarks from the recovering patient. And whilst I didn't have a recording phone at the ready, I'll admit that I was hoping for some bizarre wordplay. But my daughter instead uttered something vile. Before I repeat her confession, here's some context. My husband Ed used to go whitewater rafting with our 2 children and his brother, Darren. Some years I'd go with them, but work commitments often clashed. Anyway, Ed wasn't a particularly strong swimmer, so I always felt a little uneasy about the idea of him out on such unforgiving water without me. In late 2022, my worst fear came true. A strong current pulled my husband under, and by the time Darren had recovered his brother's body, it was too late. Ed had drowned. The following months were unspeakably awful for the entire family, but Anna was affected the most severely. To eke even a handful of words out of her became an impossible feat. Of course, that didn't stop Uncle Darren from trying, from helping the family, in Ed's absence, to survive, mentally and physically. It was no surprise to me when Darren offered to accompany us to the hospital for Anna's surgery, offered to keep Nathan company whilst my daughter underwent the procedure. And around 11 in the evening, when my daughter woke, all of those factors were filling my mind. "Hello, darling," I said softly, using a pinky to hoist Anna's sweaty bangs out of her listlessly rolling eyes. "How are you feeling?" My daughter's doped-up face observed me absently, but within the teary pools of her wandering eyes, there swam thoughts, loose, spiralling thoughts, of a mind disarrayed, but not disillusioned, and certainly not duplicitous. I trusted the words which would, eventually, spill from her puffy cheeks. Firstly, of course, came confusion. The house looks empty," Anna said in a half muffle, wafting both of her hands at the right-hand side of the hospital room, an unlit space lined with empty beds. "We're not at our house, sweet pea. We're in the recovery room," I explained. "This is a hospital, remember? Though you do have this massive space all to yourself, so I suppose it must seem quite empty." Anna responded incoherently. "Everything's fine. It was a straightforward procedure," I continued. "But you're going to feel a little out of it whilst the drug wears off, honey." "Where's the man?" she asked in a low, disoriented moan. I smiled. "Dr. Addis? He's doing the rounds. But Joyce is here. Remember her from earlier?" The young nurse, fiddling with various instruments on a trolley, looked up and beamed. "Hello again, Anna. You're being really brave. I'm going to run a few tests now, and I want you to let me know if you feel any pain or sickness, okay? It'll all be Oh, Anna interrupted. "The man." She must miss Dr. Addis, Joyce teased. I looked at the nurse apologetically. "Oh, sorry." The woman grinned widely and shook her head. "Don't be silly, Mrs. Carey. Anna, I'm sure Dr. Addis will be back soon, but we really need the man," Anna loudly said again.
Nathan didn't see.
Sweetie, I began. Then my daughter's wide eyes shot to me, and she slurred a wretched confession.
Dad didn't fall into the water. He was pushed. Don't tell Mum. He says he'll kill us if I tell Mum.
There followed silence. Silence which pressed heavily against the skin, weighing both Joyce and me to the floor. The nurse clearly felt something in Anna's words too. Something more than the drug-induced nonsense with which she must have become accustomed.
Where is the man?
My daughter whispered. And I finally understood that she was not talking about Dr. Addis. Uncle Darren and Nathan were sitting in the waiting room. That horrifying thought circled my mind as I processed Anna's claim. A supposedly nonsensical claim. That was what any rational person would believe, or at the very least want to believe. However, a memory came to the forefront of my mind. Last year on Christmas Day, Darren made a pass at me. Gin and hormones, Cynthia, my brother-in-law sheepishly promised after I spurned him. That was all. I'm sorry. I chose to accept that explanation, given that our entire family had already been through so much, but my gut never fully settled. Even before my husband's death, something about his brother didn't sit well with me, and my doubt only deepened when Uncle Darren, following Ed's death, forcibly muscled his way into my immediate family, injected himself into the main artery of our lives. Obviously, relatives should be there for a grieving family, but Darren tried time and time again to go above the call of duty. He would turn up at our home, uninvited and unannounced, to take us out for luxurious meals, would incessantly coax the children into letting him sleep over on weekends. Primarily, he achieved this by manipulating Nathan into thinking that it would be cruel for the children's dear uncle to drive home at a late hour. Worst of all, during those untoward sleepovers, I would occasionally hear footsteps echo from the upstairs landing. Would occasionally see a shadow painting the crack beneath my bedroom door. And from time to time, I would wake in a sweat to find that very same door ajar. Once, I opened half-sleeping eyes to see a figure sitting on my chair in the corner of the room. I told myself that it had simply been a dream, one fever dream of many, but I now know better.
Anna,
I feebly whimpered.
Do you understand what you just told me? Was it true?
Shh. My daughter loudly shushed me and tried to lift a finger to her lips, but her dozy limb only half cooperated.
We don't speak about it. He says he'll hear if we speak about it. He's always listening. Mrs. Carey, the nurse croaked. Should I proceed?
I shook my head, weary eyes boring into Anna's pillow. I don't know what we should be doing right now, Joyce.
Anna, was this a dream that you had? Please tell me that— This!
My daughter interrupted, showing a scar on her forearm.
This wasn't from the paddle. It was from him.
My face turned pale as I eyed the faded wound on my daughter's arm. A scar that Darren claimed Anna had acquired from her raft's paddle after it hit a rock, causing a large jagged splinter of wood to cut into her flesh. That had been a lie, and I didn't want to imagine what Darren had actually done to my daughter's arm. Things were adding up. As much as I wanted to dismiss Anna's drug-induced story, I knew that it made sense. You see, once upon a time my daughter talked and talked and talked, but she hadn't been that way since her father died. Grief had been the obvious explanation, but that never quite felt right to me. No, Anna's story, told from that hospital bed, was the truth. I understood that from the moment she spoke. I saw it in her tearful eyes. She wasn't aware of herself, wasn't aware that she'd just confessed a dark secret to her own mother.
Mrs. Carey,
the nurse continued, still seeming uncertain as to what she should say or do.
I'm going to find my son,
I said calmly, standing from the bedside chair.
Please watch Anna.
My daughter's eyes grew as she finally seemed to identify my face.
Mom?
I seized her hand and squeezed.
Everything's okay, sweetie. Just let Joyce look after you, okay? Right, everything's okay,
the nurse agreed weakly, as if I'd said the words for her benefit.
I'll do those tests now.
I rushed into the corridor and barreled forwards, followed many winding hallways, deserted at that late hour, to find my way back to the waiting area. But I was so lost in my thoughts, so lost in the laces of my Converse, that I didn't lift my head until I'd almost stumbled into the row of blue plastic chairs at the end of the hallway.
Mum?
Nathan asked, swiveling in his seat to look at me.
Are you alright? You look weird.
I'd been too frightened to look ahead. I would have had to plaster a false smile on my face so as not to arouse suspicion from Darren. But there was something far more frightening about looking up to see my son sitting alone. It was, of course, a blessing to know that I could snatch Nathan's hand and scoot him away without battling a questioning uncle. But it also terrified me. After all, Darren had gone somewhere. I dragged my son back through the clinic, back along the corridors, which seemed to stretch farther than before. I was ready to tear my daughter out of her bed, regardless of the nurse's advice.
Mum, slow down,
Nathan pleaded, attempting to wriggle out of my handhold as we rushed towards Anna's room.
Sorry, Nathan,
I panted as I shoved the door open.
But I need to...
I didn't finish that thought. The recovery room was alarmingly quiet. Anna's segment, semi-partitioned from the rest of the space by a thick curtain of green fabric, was the only lit section of the large area. Above her bed, a solitary fluorescent light hummed loudly, the only sound in the room. I rushed towards my unattended daughter and cried, "Where's Joyce?" Anna looked at me with teary eyes.
She's here.
Rather than unpacking that remark, I pulled the duvet off my half-conscious daughter's robed body.
We're going home now, Anna. Come on, Nathan and I will help.
My son slipped his sister's limp arm around his neck, and I ran around to the left-hand side of the bed. But before I reached my daughter, I slipped, trainer soles squeaking unbearably on the tiles below. Fortunately, my hand reflexively reached outwards and gripped onto the green curtain for security. I knew I shouldn't look down, but I did. There, starting to stain the lower half of my white Converse, was a pool of red. A pool spreading from a source on the other side of the partitioning curtain.
This wasn't pulled so far across before,
I thought, rubbing the fabric between my unsteady fingers. A thought which only filled my mind because I so desperately wanted a distraction. A distraction from the horror of wading through that gunky liquid. A tainted river that, no matter how shallow it may have actually been, seemed to resist my feet as they pushed onwards.
Mom?
Nathan asked as he helped Hannah stand on the other side of the bed.
Are you okay?
I answered not with words, but heavy breathing. and I lifted my twitching eyes to the curtain. Then I tore the green fabric backwards, and the blackened side of the room was revealed once more. 5 shadowy beds with unlit light fixtures above. I don't remember whether I screamed, as something in my soul disconnected when I saw what lay on Anna's neighbouring bed. The lifeless body of Nurse Joyce. The woman's face and scrubs were drenched with thick layers of blood. Her mouth hung open in a final cry, and her eyes were gone. Gone not in the sense that they had been clawed to ribbons, but in the sense that they had been plucked cleanly from their sockets. 2 deep cavities filled her skull, and her body had been gutted. What remained of the blood in her near-exsanguinated body was gushing onto the floor, adding to the growing puddle below. When I turned to face my children, I was thankful that Anna's vacant eyes were staring at the corner of the room. However, Nathan saw Joyce's body, in spite of my effort to stand in the way, and he began to cry, began to buckle under the weight of his sister. "Look at me, both of you," I pleaded, nearly skidding in the puddle a second time as I rounded the edge of the bed. "Please." Nathan bawled as I tried to sling Anna's right arm over my shoulder, hoping to escort both of my children out of that nightmare, but my daughter shrugged me off. Before I said a word, Anna pointed a shaking finger at the spot she'd been eyeballing, pointed at something past the darkened beds. She might even have tried to say something out of her gauze-filled mouth, jumbled, meaningless words. My daughter seemed even less coherent than before, but I trusted her. I followed her jabbing finger, and when I finally eyed the corner of the room, I saw something worse than Joyce's corpse. There was just enough light to illuminate the recovery area's vague outline. The 6 segregating curtains had been drawn back to the wall, revealing the full stretch of the room, revealing 5 empty beds and 1 bearing the nurse's mutilated body. But the single light shining above Anna's bed barely lit a thing. The room was, rather, illuminated by light pouring through the window on the far wall, a long glass pane which invited a smidge of moonlight. With moderate squinting, I discerned the shape of an armchair in the room's corner, a seat only partially visible, much like the featureless head rising above its backrest. Somebody was sitting in the darkness, watching us. He wriggled like a codfish as his lungs filled with water, came Darren's voice from the blackness. But I kept one of his ears above the surface, Cynthia. That way he could hear me explain, in great detail, all of the things I wanted to do to you. "Run!" I shrieked at my children as the shape lunged forwards. There came the crying of my son, the door handle squeaking downwards, and a man's broad shoe soles hurriedly beating against the floor. Loudening as Darren, lost in the shadows, charged towards me. There is no horror quite like an unseen thing approaching. Then the man hurled his body, flung it as if it weren't even a part of him, into me. No matter how monstrous that rag doll, he was at the end of the day still a man. A heavy-set man with a bulging gut and eyes to match. I was caught so rigidly within his animalistic gaze, which saw me only as prey, that I barely noticed the searing pain in my belly. The agony came, of course, once the adrenaline started to wear off. "I didn't mean to kill her," the man muttered, his scentless breath stinging my eyes as he hovered an inch away from my face. "She was just in the wrong place. This wasn't This wasn't part of the plan, Cynthia. We have to go, sweetie. We have to go right now. Children or no children, I don't care. It's up to you. There was something horrific about trying and failing to smell the man's breath. Inhuman breath, neither stale nor rosy. That was Darren. Had always been Darren. Why would his breath have a scent? He was nothing. An empty vessel. I'd always known that somehow. I just didn't have proof, until Anna made her dreadful confession. Once that horrifying thought abated, realization hit. Pain hit. I understood, as my abdomen started to throb, that my brother-in-law had buried sharp steel in my flesh. Sharp steel which fell just shy of puncturing my lung. As Darren continued to twist the knife deeper into my gut, causing me to splutter, he lifted my free hand to my hair and brushed it off my ear. A practiced idea of what it means to be human. Something he'd seen me do to Anna, most likely. Something he did not understand. And that made me feel sicker, for it proved that the creature before me was no person. But that awful concept also motivated me to plunge my quaking fingers into the back pocket of my jeans. Don't worry about this, Darren whispered, motioning at the blade in my stomach. I'll take you back to the van right away. Quietly. We'll lie low, and I'll get you fixed up. I'll tend to you, care for you, just as I have for the past 2 years. I will be better than my weak, pathetic excuse for a... Halfway through the man's monologue, I did something which I expected to be the end of me. Powered by the last dregs of adrenaline and blood in my fading body, I swung my makeshift weapon, a set of keys wielded between my 2 middle fingers, and I did not choose a non-fatal mark. When the keys met Darren's jugular, his flapping lips froze mid-sentence. Then my husband's killer released the fingers gripping the knife, which stayed firmly in my gut, and he moved that hand towards his bleeding neck. Tried to cover the wound as he staggered backwards and spat droplets of blood in lieu of words. I moved with his body as he pulled away, fearing what would happen if I were to lose that opportunity, and I repeatedly thrust those brass blades into his throat, intending to inflict as much damage as possible, intending to stop Darren from ever hurting my family again. I didn't want him to rot in prison, as I knew I would forever live in terror of him escaping, finding us. The next time, he wouldn't have kept me alive as some plaything. He would have sought revenge, would have ended me. I saw that in his dying eyes. Moreover, I wanted Darren to drown. A fitting end, given what he did to my dear Ed. And my brother-in-law suffered a worse fate, in fact, as he drowned in his own blood. They say his airways filled with it. Hardly surprising, given that I stabbed the man 46 times, left his neck a mangled, mushy mouth of red. Darren was pronounced dead 10 minutes later by emergency responders. Dr. Addis had dialed 999 when my children found him in a nearby corridor and explained the situation. Addis did, of course, immediately rush to Darren's aid. Such was his oath. That was why I ensured there would be no salvaging my brother-in-law. To let him live would have led to a nightmare. After all, even dead, the man haunts me. I will always hear, as I lie in my room at night, Darren's unholy confession of what he did to the love of my life. Will always hear an unspoken confession of what he was going to do to me. Will always see him sitting on that chair in the corner of my bedroom.